4 centuries, military professionals shared a single, core belief: victory belonged to whoever could force a decisive battle and hold the ground when the fighting stopped. This idea wasn't just a theory. It was the foundation of Western warfare, shaped by the vast, open fields of Europe and America. On these battlefields, you could see everything: formations marching in neat lines, cavalry charging, and outcomes that were clear, measurable, and easy to report back to kings, presidents, and generals. United States Army doctrine, from the highest federal officials down to the most junior officers, was built on this very principle. You win a war by controlling territory and utterly destroying the enemy's army in a direct, head-on confrontation. It was simple, it was brutal, and it had worked time and time again. So, when the U.S. military turned its attention to the Seminoles of Florida, they were immediately classified as an inferior fighting force. Why? Because the Seminoles simply refused to play by the rules. They wouldn't line up in neat formations to be shot at. They didn't build cities that could be besieged and captured. They didn't present a grand army on an open field, ready for annihilation. To the American commanders, this was baffling. It was a sign of weakness. Any group that actively avoided a pitched battle, in their minds, was already losing. Retreat wasn't a strategy. It was a confession of defeat. This rule seemed unbreakable, uncheckable, because the United States Army had everything on its side. It had powerful artillery that could shatter enemy lines. It had disciplined infantry, trained to march into the teeth of enemy fire and hold their ground. And most importantly, it had the unwavering confidence of a young, powerful nation convinced of its manifest destiny to expand westward. The officers in charge simply assumed that sheer persistence would be enough. They believed they could just keep pushing, keep pressing, and eventually, the Seminole resistance would crumble and collapse under the weight of American power. But in 1835, a single, shocking event in the swamps of Florida would shatter that belief forever, forcing the United States Army to confront a new, terrifying kind of war. The conflict, which would become known as the Second Seminole War, wasn't just a fight for land. It was a clash of philosophies. For the U.S., it was about imposing order and expanding its borders. For the Seminoles, it was a desperate struggle for survival, for their homes, their freedom, and their very existence. The American strategy was straightforward: march columns of soldiers into Seminole territory, find their villages, and force a battle. General Duncan Clinch, a veteran commander, was tasked with executing this plan. He assembled a force of regular Army soldiers and Florida militia, confident that he could bring the Seminoles to heel. The Seminoles, however, were not a conventional army. They were a confederation of different bands and groups, including native Floridians and black Seminoles, formerly enslaved people who had escaped to Florida and found freedom and alliance among the tribes. Their leader, Osceola, was not a general in the American sense, but he was a brilliant and charismatic strategist. He understood the land in a way the American soldiers never could. The dense swamps, thick forests, and winding rivers of Florida were not obstacles to the Seminoles. They were allies. They were their fortress. Osceola knew that meeting the Americans in an open field would be suicide. His warriors were armed with rifles, but they couldn't match the sheer firepower and disciplined volleys of the U.S. infantry, let alone their cannons. So, he chose a different path. He would use the land itself as his primary weapon. The Seminoles would strike quickly from ambush, inflict casualties, and then melt back into the swamp before the Americans could even organize a response. They would harass supply lines, attack isolated patrols, and make the cost of occupying their land unbearably high. This strategy came to a head in December of 1835. Major Francis Dade was ordered to lead a relief column of over 100 men from Fort Brooke, near modern-day Tampa, to reinforce the troops at Fort King, about 100 miles north. Dade, like his superiors, underestimated his opponent. His column marched confidently, in neat lines, right through the heart of Seminole territory. They were a perfect target. For 5 long days, they marched. The Seminole Warriors, led by Micanopy, Alligator, and Jumper, shadowed them the entire way, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They knew the terrain intimately. They chose a spot where the trail narrowed, flanked by dense palmetto scrub and pine trees. It was a natural kill zone. On the morning of December 28th, as the soldiers marched through the open pine barren, the ambush was sprung. From out of nowhere, a single shot rang out the signal. Major Dade, mounted on his horse, was one of the first to fall. Immediately, a devastating volley of rifle fire ripped through the American column from the hidden Seminole positions. The soldiers, caught completely by surprise, fell into chaos. The disciplined lines they were so proud of instantly disintegrated. Officers screamed orders that no one could hear over the gunfire and the panicked cries of the wounded. The soldiers who survived the initial volley desperately tried to form a defensive position. They threw themselves to the ground and began building a small, triangular breastwork out of felled pine trees. 4 hours they fought for their lives, trapped in the open, while the Seminoles, concealed by the terrain, picked them off one by one. The American artillery, which was supposed to give them a decisive advantage, was almost useless. The crews were shot down before they could even effectively bring their cannon to bear. The fighting was relentless and brutal. When the Seminole Warriors finally ceased their long-range fire, they swarmed the makeshift fortification, overwhelming the few remaining defenders in a final, desperate hand-to-hand struggle. By the time it was over, of the 108 men in Dade's command, only 3 managed to escape, all of them severely wounded. One died the next day on his journey back. The other 2, Ransom Clark and Joseph Sprague, eventually made it back to Fort Brooke, their horrifying stories serving as the first news of the disaster. The Dade Massacre, as it came to be known, was a profound shock to the United States. It was a brutal and undeniable message. The Seminoles were not a weak, disorganized force that would simply retreat. They were a determined and highly effective fighting force that could, and would, annihilate a conventional American army unit. The rules of war, as the U.S. military understood them, did not apply here. The belief that avoiding battle was a sign of weakness was proven catastrophically wrong. Retreat wasn't weakness, it was a tactic. And ambush wasn't a cowardly act, it was a brilliant use of terrain and local knowledge. The news of Dade's defeat sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. It marked the true beginning of a war that would become the longest, costliest, and bloodiest of all the American Indian Wars. The United States would pour thousands of troops and millions of dollars into Florida, cycling through numerous commanders, each with a new plan to subdue the Seminoles. But for 7 long years, the Seminoles, using the same guerrilla tactics that destroyed Dade's column, resisted. They turned Florida's unforgiving landscape into a strategic asset. The swamps that gave American soldiers malaria and dysentery were the Seminoles' sanctuary. The dense vegetation that made marching in formation impossible provided them with perfect cover. They fought a war of ghosts and shadows, a war the U.S. Army was completely unprepared for. The Dade Massacre was more than just a military defeat. It was a lesson written in blood. It demonstrated that victory isn't always about holding ground or winning decisive battles. Sometimes, victory is about survival, resilience, and refusing to fight on your enemy's terms. The Seminoles taught the United States that a smaller, less technologically advanced force could effectively challenge a modern army by turning its strengths, discipline, formations, and firepower into weaknesses. It was a lesson that would echo through history, from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan. The belief that had guided Western armies for centuries was shattered in a Florida pine forest by a people who simply refused to lose. They call me Osceola. It is not the name my mother gave me, but it is the name the Americans will remember. I am 30 years old. My life has been a long walk away from my home, pushed by the endless hunger of these newcomers. They come with papers and promises. Their words are soft as summer rain, but their actions are like the hurricane that tears the cypress from the earth. I have seen their treaties, signed with ink that disappears before it dries. I have watched my people, the Seminole, shrink our world to appease them, only to find they want the last of it too. Now, they demand we leave this land, Florida, our home. They want to ship us like cattle to a strange place west of the Great River, a place they call Indian Territory. They say it is for our own good. They say we cannot survive here. They say resistance is futile. Their agents, with their stiff uniforms and arrogant eyes, tell our chiefs that their great white father in Washington has decided our fate. They believe their own words. They believe their power is absolute. I have learned their languages. I learned English not to befriend them, but to understand the shape of their lies. I learned Spanish to speak with those who were here before them. I learned the languages of the forest, the swamp, the river, the languages that truly matter here. These are the languages the Americans cannot speak. They see Florida as a swamp to be drained, a problem to be solved. I see it as our fortress. The soldiers come in their ordered lines, their bright coats making them perfect targets against the green of the hammock. They bring their heavy cannons, which sink into the muck and mire. They believe in the open field, in the clear line of fire, in a war fought by their rules. Here, there are no open fields. There are only tangled roots, deep water, and a million places to hide. Their numbers mean nothing when 100 soldiers can march past 10 of my warriors and never see them. Their firepower means nothing when they are shooting at ghosts in the mist. They think this is a war of battles. They want a grand fight, a day where armies meet and the victor is decided. I will never give them that day. This is not a war for land. We already have the land. This is a war for time. It is a war of mosquitoes and fever, of sudden raids in the deep of night, of supply lines cut and sentries who disappear without a sound. It is a war of the mind. We must make them doubt. We must make them tired. We must make them understand that to stay here will cost them more than they are willing to pay. I have stood in their councils. I have listened to their agents tell our great leader Mechanipe that he must sign the paper, that he must lead his people away. I have watched some of our own, weary from the long struggle, begin to believe them. They say we cannot fight an empire. They say we are too few. But how do you count the shadows in a forest? How do you measure the spirit of a people who refuse to be broken? When the agent, Wiley Thompson, demanded I add my mark to the treaty of removal, I took my knife and drove it through the paper, pinning it to the table. This is the only treaty I will make with the whites. I told them. That was not just defiance. It was a promise. A promise to this land, to my ancestors buried in its soil, and to the children who will be born here. They call me a renegade, a savage, but who is the savage? The one who defends his home, or the one who crosses an ocean to steal it from another? They send generals, one after another. First Clinch, then Gaines, then Scott, then Jessup. Each one arrives with a new plan, more men, and a bigger budget. They promise their leaders in Washington a quick victory, and each one leaves in failure, replaced by the next, their careers stained by the Florida swamps. They cannot force us to fight their way. They chase us into the Everglades, a place they call a hideous wilderness. For us, it is a sanctuary. The water and sawgrass that exhaust their soldiers give us life. They are visitors here. We are the land. My warriors are not soldiers in their sense. They are hunters, fathers, and husbands. They do not fight for pay or for a distant government. They fight for the ground beneath their feet and for the family sleeping in their chickee. They know how to move without a sound, how to read the bend of a branch, the ripple on the water. They know that a single, well-placed shot from the cover of a cypress knee is worth more than a volley from 100 muskets in the open. We fight with the patience of the alligator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This war is not about winning. For us, winning is simply surviving. It is about enduring. It is about waking up another day on this land, free. The Americans cannot understand this. Their world is built on conquest and finality. They must have a surrender, a signed document, a clear end. Our victory is in denying them that. Our victory is the unease in their camps at night, the fear of the unseen enemy, the constant drain on their resources and their will. They will capture some of us. They will trick our chiefs into talking peace, and then put them in chains. They have already done so. They captured King Philip, and they will try to capture me. They believe, as they cut down the tallest trees, the forest will fall. But we are not like their forests of single, towering oaks. We are like the mangrove, our roots intertwined, each one supporting the other. If one is cut, the rest hold fast and new shoots grow. I know this path may lead to my death. I have seen it in my dreams. But what is death compared to a life in chains, in a strange land, with no memory of home? It is better to die a free man in Florida than to live as a slave in the West. This fight is not just for the Seminole. It is a message to all who believe that might makes right. It is a testament that a determined people, who know their land and are willing to sacrifice everything for it, can stand against the most powerful empire on earth. They cannot win because they do not know what they are fighting for, beyond a simple greed for more land. We know what we are fighting for. We fight for the call of the limpkin at dawn. We fight for the scent of the orange blossom on the breeze. We fight for the spirits of our ancestors who guide our steps. We fight for the future of our children, that they might know this home as we have. I am Osceola. And as long as I breathe, as long as one Seminole heart beats in this land, the war for Florida will not be over. They will have no peace. They will have no rest. They will have no certainty. They will only have the swamp, the heat, and the constant, unnerving feeling that they are not alone, and that they will never, ever be welcome here. We will not surrender. We will not leave. This is our land, and we will fight for it until the last drop of our blood seeps into the soil from which we were born. Imagine you were in the heart of the Florida swamps. The air is thick, heavy with the drone of insects and the oppressive, wet heat. You move with fewer than 100 warriors, your feet silent on the sodden earth. Every man beside you understands the fundamental truth of this war. Survival is not found in strength, but in invisibility. This land, this labyrinth of cypress and sawgrass, is your greatest ally. Meanwhile, the American columns advance. Hundreds of soldiers, clad in heavy wool, trudge through the same terrain. But for them, it is an enemy. The water, sometimes waist deep, slows their march to a crawl. The relentless sun and clouds of mosquitoes sap their will. Their commanders, guided by maps that show little of the true landscape, are lost in a sea of green. From your hidden positions in the dense vegetation, you watch them. You see the frustration on their faces as they struggle to cover even a few miles in a day. They are powerful, yes, but here, their power is meaningless. Your leader, Osceola, has taught you the art of the unseen strike. The first shots are never meant to kill, not primarily. They are meant to sow chaos. A single rifle cracks from the tree line, then another from a different direction. The sound echoes, distorted by the swamp, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. The soldiers, startled and disoriented, react as they were trained. They form lines, raise their rifles, and fire blindly into the wall of green that surrounds them. Their volleys tear through leaves and splinter branches, but they find no targets. By the time their return fire can land, you are already gone, melting back into the shadows of the swamp. Each engagement is a phantom dance. It lasts only minutes, a fleeting, violent burst of noise and confusion, but the psychological effect on the American troops lasts 4 weeks. They march with a constant, gnawing fear. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, could be an ambush. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere at once. This uncertainty is a more potent weapon than any bullet. It fractures their command structure, erodes their discipline, and shatters their morale. Commanders shout orders that are lost in the panic, and soldiers are left to wonder if they are fighting men or ghosts. Our strategy is not to win battles in the conventional sense. We cannot match their numbers or their firepower. Instead, we bleed them slowly. We strike their supply lines, the vulnerable veins that stretch for miles through hostile territory. A small party of warriors can descend upon a wagon train, seize what we need: food, ammunition, medicine, and vanish before a proper defense can be mounted. We isolate their detachments, picking off small groups of soldiers who stray too far from the main column. When they organize a pursuit, we withdraw, leading them on a futile chase deeper into the swamp, where the land itself becomes their pursuer. The American commanders send reports back to Washington, filled with frustration and bewilderment. They describe skirmishes with no clear outcome, engagements where the enemy simply disappears. There is no battlefield to conquer, no territory to hold that can signify victory. They claim to control the forts, but the land in between remains ours. How do you measure victory when the enemy refuses to stand and fight? How do you defeat an army that lives in the water and the trees? The war, which they expected to be swift, stretches into years. The cost skyrockets. What was meant to be a simple removal operation becomes a national quagmire. In Washington, politicians debate the exploding budget. On the front lines, morale collapses. Soldiers, many of whom are young and far from home, begin to question what they are fighting for. They are dying not just from our bullets, but from disease, malaria, dysentery, infections that fester in the humid climate. The swamp is a more relentless killer than any warrior. American officers, trained in the Napoleonic tactics of pitched battles and decisive engagements, grow increasingly desperate. They achieve tactical successes, burning villages and destroying crops, but these victories are hollow. They produce no strategic result. We simply rebuild deeper in the swamp. For every leader they capture or kill, another rises to take their place. They capture our women and children, hoping to use them as leverage, but this only hardens our resolve. The Seminole people will not be broken. The commander's right of an enemy who is perfumed with cunning, who fights like a wolf. They cannot comprehend a war without front lines, without a clear objective to seize. They try to build roads and forts, to impose order on the chaos, but the swamp resists. Roads are washed away in the seasonal rains, and forts become isolated islands of misery, their garrisons slowly wasting away from sickness and boredom. The turning point comes not on a battlefield, but in the minds of the American leadership. They begin to understand the futility of their mission. They are trying to defeat a people who are inseparable from the land they are fighting on. To pacify the Seminole would require pacifying the swamp itself, an impossible task. Failure seems inevitable, not because of a decisive defeat, but because they realize they cannot declare victory. The grand, conclusive battle they need to justify the cost in blood and treasure will never come. We will never give it to them. This long, brutal conflict, the most expensive Indian war in United States history, becomes a ghost in the national memory. It is a story of resilience, of a small nation of warriors who, through ingenuity and an unbreakable will, held the world's most powerful army at bay 4 years. They fought for their homes, for their freedom, and for their very existence, using the one weapon the Americans could not counter, the land itself. If you find this kind of forgotten history as fascinating as we do, we would be honored if you subscribed. In the heart of Florida's untamed wilderness, a war was fought that would forever change the American military. This wasn't a conflict of grand battles and glorious charges, but a brutal, grinding struggle in swamps and sawgrass, a war that defied every rule in the Army's playbook. This is the story of the Seminole Wars, a conflict that forced the United States to question the very meaning of victory. 4 years, the U.S. Army, a force forged in the traditions of European warfare, pursued the Seminole people. The goal was simple: removal. drive them from their ancestral lands, and relocate them west of the Mississippi. But the Seminoles, a resilient confederacy of Native Americans and escaped African slaves, refused to yield. They knew the land in a way their pursuers never could. They melted into the cypress swamps, striking from the shadows and vanishing like ghosts. The American commanders, men like Andrew Jackson and Zachary Taylor, expected a swift, decisive campaign. They brought overwhelming numbers and superior firepower. They built forts, cut roads, and deployed thousands of troops, yet victory remained elusive. The Seminoles, led by brilliant and defiant figures like Osceola, waged a masterful guerrilla campaign. They refused to meet the Americans in open battle, where they would surely be crushed. Instead, they used the terrain as their greatest weapon. The dense, unforgiving landscape of Florida became their fortress. For the American soldiers, Florida was a living nightmare. They waded through chest-deep, snake-infested waters, tormented by mosquitoes and ravaged by diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Their heavy wool uniforms were a curse in the humid heat. Supply lines were constantly ambushed. Every step was a struggle against an unseen enemy and a hostile environment. The war dragged on, year after agonizing year. The conflict became a national obsession and a national embarrassment. It was draining the U.S. Treasury, costing millions upon millions of dollars, a staggering sum for the time. The human cost was even greater. Thousands of American soldiers died, not just in combat, but from the brutal conditions. Far from home, they were buried in unmarked graves, their sacrifices seemingly for nothing. On the other side, the cost was immeasurable. Seminole families were torn apart, driven deeper and deeper into the swamps, forced to survive in the most inhospitable corners of their own land. They faced starvation and constant fear, yet their will to resist never broke. The American High Command grew desperate. They had more soldiers, more guns, more resources, but they couldn't force a surrender. They controlled the forts and the roads, but they didn't control the land or the people. This frustrating reality forced a painful reckoning within the military. Planners began to understand the difficult truth: control without submission is an illusion. You can occupy a territory, but if the people's spirit remains unbroken, you haven't won. You've merely created a stalemate. The war in Florida was teaching a lesson that would echo through American history. Conventional armies struggle against determined, irregular forces fighting on their home turf. The promise of a quick, decisive outcome, the very foundation of American military doctrine, was crumbling in the Florida muck. One of the most powerful symbols of this resistance was a warrior named Osceola. He was not a hereditary chief, but his charisma, intelligence, and fierce defiance made him a natural leader. Osceola became the face of the Seminole struggle, a figure of both fear and grudging respect for the Americans. He repeatedly outsmarted U.S. generals, leading daring raids and inspiring his people to continue the fight. His fame spread across the nation, making him a household name. But his story ends in tragedy and betrayal. In 1837, under a white flag of truce, a sacred symbol of negotiation, Osceola was captured. The American commander, General Thomas Jessup, justified this violation of international custom by arguing that the Seminoles themselves had broken promises. Osceola was imprisoned, first at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, and then moved to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. Weakened by chronic malaria and likely suffering from a severe throat infection, his health rapidly declined. The defiant warrior who had roamed the vast wilderness of Florida was now confined to a small, damp cell. He died in captivity just a few months later. But even in death, Osceola's legacy grew. His capture under a flag of truce sparked public outrage in the United States and abroad. It was seen as a dishonorable act, a stain on the nation's character. Osceola became a martyr, a symbol of righteous resistance against overwhelming power. His fight wasn't just for land, it was for dignity, for freedom, for the right to exist. And his story, his defiance, fundamentally reshaped American military thinking. The ghost of Osceola would haunt future campaigns. The Seminole Wars eventually wound down, not with a triumphant peace treaty or a grand surrender, but with a weary acceptance of reality. A small, unconquered remnant of the Seminole people remained hidden in the Everglades, where their descendants live to this day. They are proudly known as the unconquered people. The United States had spent a fortune in blood and treasure, and had failed to achieve its primary objective of complete removal. The war in Florida became a cautionary tale within the U.S. Army, a school of hard knocks that taught painful lessons about the limits of military power. The shadow of this failure would stretch far into the future, influencing how America approached conflicts against irregular forces in places like the Philippines, Vietnam, and beyond. The Seminole War became a warning, not a triumph. It demonstrated that superior technology and numbers are not a guarantee of success. It proved that understanding the culture, the motivations, and the environment of an adversary is just as important as military might. Power without understanding cannot achieve lasting control. This story from nearly 200 years ago is not just a dusty chapter in a history book. It is a living lesson that is profoundly relevant today. It reminds us that the human spirit's desire for freedom is a powerful force. It challenges us to look beyond simple narratives of victory and defeat, and to consider the immense human cost of conflict. The responsibility of memory now rests with us, because forgotten wars and their painful lessons have a way of repeating themselves. The stories of the soldiers buried far from home, and the Seminole families who fought for their very survival, deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, please click the like button. It truly helps keep this history alive for a new generation. We are committed to rescuing more of these forgotten stories from the archives, and we invite you to subscribe and join our community of history lovers. In the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and if you have a family member who served in the military, we'd be honored if you shared that with us. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Osceola and the thousands who fought for their freedom are never forgotten, because history only survives when we choose to remember it.